Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about an exciting chapter in the history of Great Britain, when Germanic people moved there and changed everything. These groups didn't just show up and live quietly. They brought their own culture and language, which eventually became known as Anglo Saxon. This was the beginning of Old English, a language similar to one spoken across the North Sea in a place called Friesland. The first Germanic people who arrived were probably soldiers working for the Romans around the 4th century. But things really started changing in the early 5th century, when Roman rule ended, and more Germanic settlers arrived, influencing the way people lived and governed. We still don't know everything about how this migration happened. For example, we're not sure how many people came, when exactly they arrived, or what happened to the local population. There aren't many written records from that time, and the ones we have often talk about violence. But archaeologists and scientists studying DNA are helping us learn more. One surprising thing is that the local Celtic languages didn't affect Old English much at all. This makes it seem like the Germanic influence happened quickly and in a big way. Some people even think large parts of the local population were forced to move out. But another idea is that it wasn't about large numbers of people, but about the power of a small group of Germanic warriors. They may have been so influential that the locals started speaking their language and adopting their way of life. Archaeological discoveries back this up because, while there were big cultural changes, people kept living in the same kinds of settlements. Now let's jump to some modern research. A big DNA study in 2022 found that many people from what is now northwestern Germany moved to Britain. But here's the interesting part. They didn't stay separate from the locals. They married them, creating families with mixed heritage. This wasn't a short-term thing either. The migration happened over hundreds of years, from Roman times into the 8th century. What's cool is that burials from that time show people of different ancestries being buried in similar ways, showing how their cultures blended together. And while the eastern part of England shows the strongest influence from these newcomers, it's less noticeable in the west. So, the story isn't the same everywhere. It's different depending on the region. One of the few written stories we have from this time comes from a man named Gildas, who lived in the early 6th century. He wrote about a time when British leaders invited Saxons to help them fight off attacks from the Picts and Scots. At first, the Saxons helped, but things eventually fell apart. Gildas said this led to a long war. The Britons won back control, but life didn't go back to normal. The country was full of problems, and even though the Saxons weren't in charge, their presence made things harder for the locals. Gildas didn't tell us much more about the Saxons, but his work influenced later writers like Bede. By Bede's time, the Anglo Saxon kingdoms were fully established. Back then, people thought these kingdoms had always been purely Germanic, but today historians think it was more complicated. Both local Britons and the newcomers likely worked together to create these early kingdoms. And historical records from the 5th and 6th centuries are really scarce, so historians have to piece together the story from fragments. One such source is the Chronica Gallica, written in southeastern Gaul. It only gives brief mentions, like a note about raids on Britain in 409, tying them to the declining power of the Roman Empire and growing external threats. It doesn't give us much detail though, since it groups Britain's struggles with similar invasions in Gaul and Spain. Gildas, who lived in the 6th century, provides one of the most detailed contemporary accounts in his work, De Excitio et Conquestu Britanniae. But even his writings are more of a moral critique than a straightforward historical record. He describes the Saxons as soldiers invited by Romano-British leaders to help defend against raids. Yet he's vague on dates and doesn't even mention ongoing Saxon migrations or conflicts during his time. His work paints the Saxons as a punishment from God for the moral failings of the Britons. It's less about the events themselves and more about using them as an example of divine retribution. To get a clearer timeline, historians often turn to Bede, an English monk who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People in the 8th century. Bede tried to date key events like the arrival of Hengist and Horsa. legendary leaders of the Saxons. He relied heavily on earlier works like Gildas, and aimed to organize events chronologically, making him one of the earliest historians in Britain. However, his accounts are not without problems. For instance, some of his dates seem to be guesses based on vague references, such as Gildas' mention of a plea to the Roman general Aetius in 446. Another 6th-century writer, Procopius, offers a more distant perspective from the Eastern Roman Empire. He mentions an island called Brittia, supposedly not Britain, being settled by the Angles, Frisians, and Britons. According to him, these groups were so populous that they sent people yearly to settle in Frankish territories. Interestingly, he doesn't mention Saxons or Jutes, and his accounts are often seen as unreliable because he expressed doubts about the stories himself. Modern historians like Michael Jones note that Procopius' claims don't hold up well under scrutiny. Returning to Gildas, his work reflects the chaotic transition from Roman rule to local monarchical power in Britain. He describes the Britons as being their own worst enemies, more focused on internal conflicts than defending against external threats. He called the Saxons foederati, a Roman term for allied troops, suggesting they initially came under formal agreements to assist the Roman administration. By using the term patria for the Saxons, Gildas hints that some Saxons might have already been considered native to Britain by his time. Bede's writings, meanwhile, shaped how later generations viewed this period. He expanded on Gildas' idea that the Saxons were divine punishment, but reframed them as instruments of Britain's redemption. This interpretation added weight to the idea of Anglo-Saxon dominance and overshadowed the role of native Britons. Scholars like Wendy McKinney argue that Bede's use of ethnic terms wasn't just about race, but also about loyalty and cultural identity. Bede's narratives blended tradition with religious themes, complicating efforts to separate fact from interpretation. Other sources, like the tribal Heidige, give us a glimpse into the structure of early Anglo-Saxon society. This document lists 35 tribes and assigns land areas to each, suggesting a patchwork of small kingdoms and territories. While some tribes remain unidentified, the list reveals the importance of family and local identities during this time. It also shows that early Anglo-Saxon settlement wasn't one unified effort, but a complex mix of small, independent groups. Finally, we have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of king lists and genealogies compiled in the 8th and 9th centuries. While it claims to record events from the settlement period, modern scholars like Barbara York and David Dumville caution against taking it at face value. Many entries mix historical events with myth, like the story of Portsmouth being named after an invader named Port. Still, some parts, like the accounts of L of Sussex, may contain kernels of truth, even if the dates and details are questionable. Dumville reminds us that medieval historians had different views on separating fact from fiction, making these records both valuable and challenging to interpret. And linguistic evidence is an important clue in understanding how the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain unfolded. The story of Old English shows how language, culture, and identity mixed during this time. Historian Nicholas Hyam suggests that many local Britons adopted the language, traditions, and customs of Anglo-Saxon leaders to improve their status. This process shaped new social norms and created stories about Britain's origins. After the Roman Empire fell, Latin lost its importance as the government and economy collapsed. In this gap, Old English, a language brought by a small group of Germanic-speaking settlers, became more widely used. Speaking Old English not only helped people fit into society, but also marked them as part of the dominant group. Hyam notes that using Old English could offer significant advantages, such as legal rights and social acceptance. Before this change, most people in Roman Britain spoke British Celtic or British Latin. But by the 8th century, Old English was the main language in what is now Eastern and Southern England. This shift happened much faster than in other parts of the former Roman Empire, like Gaul or Spain, where invaders adopted local languages. Old English has very few words borrowed from Celtic or Latin, showing how complete this change was. Most place names in England also come from Old English, even in areas with strong Celtic roots. Research has uncovered more Britannic and Latin place names than once thought, but they are still rare, especially in Eastern England. Historians have different ideas about how Old English became so dominant. In the past, some believed that Anglo Saxon settlers wiped out or drove away local Britons. While a few experts still think this might be true, most now believe it was a less violent process. The political power of Anglo-Saxon leaders likely encouraged Britons to learn Old English. With the Roman system in ruins, Latin became less useful, making Old English the better choice for those seeking economic or social opportunities. Over time, people who spoke both Britannic and Old English began speaking only Old English, as it provided more benefits. The disappearance of Roman-era place names is another mystery. Some Britannic names were altered to sound like Old English, while others were replaced entirely. Frequent changes in settlements and land ownership also contributed to the loss of old names. This wasn't just caused by Anglo-Saxon settlers. It was part of a broader pattern across Roman Britain. Experts are still debating whether British Celtic influenced Old English. Some think Celtic languages affected its sounds and grammar, but clear evidence is hard to find. Most agree, however, that many Britannic speakers eventually switched to Old English. Researchers are also exploring whether this shift included lower-class Germanic-speaking immigrants, or was mainly driven by elites. Questions remain about the social rules and systems that made Old English so prestigious, and how quickly Britannic and Latin disappeared in different areas. The story of British elites adds another layer to this history. Some Anglo-Saxon dynasties may have had Britannic origins. For example, the Wessex royal family, thought to be Germanic, includes leaders like Cerdic, whose name is Britannic. Other rulers, such as Cialan and Cadwalla, also had Britannic names, suggesting a mix of cultures. The Mercian royal family has similar examples, with names that hint at Brittonic roots. Even in the church, figures like Saint Chad and his brothers had Britannic names, although they were considered English. This blending of British and Anglo-Saxon elites paints a more complex picture of integration. In areas like Wessex, Kent, and East Anglia, native leaders may have adopted Anglo-Saxon language and customs, while keeping parts of their original identity. This mix of cultures helped shape the unique history of post-Roman Britain.